Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the history of violence in public schools. This presentation is from Kathy, Rachel, and Vincent. So today's objectives: by the end of the presentation, you will be able to define violence and the contributing factors of violence in our school systems, learn of the violent events in the U.S. public schools, and understand how public school violence is also a public health problem. So first off, what is violence? According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the definition of the noun violence is the use of physical force so as to injure, abuse, damage, or destroy. From this definition, we can gather that the violence does not always result in deaths, but more or less can still cause serious damages to the victims. So what does violence have to do in relation to schools? Well, according to Midlarsky and Klain, violence has become a socio-behavioral phenomenon in response to the society of the evolution of schools. As schools have evolved, scientists and researchers identified that violence in schools have fluctuated in response to varying social conditions of student communities. In response to this discovery, Midlarsky and Klain have categorized school system violence based on historical records and patterns. The first category is the act of rebellion. So in which case the students will exhibit rebellious episodes that can be characterized by an impromptu clash when malicious intent is absent from the one committing the act. The second category is classified as action out of anger. Action out of anger means it has a focused agenda and goal in mind. It is a premeditated action that is being committed. The third category is behaving violently out of protest. This classification involves protests that are purely based on a belief or cause which they demonstrate, object to symbolically, or engage in physical violence with. The fourth and final category that Midlarsky and Klain presented was the random act of violence. The person committing the violence usually picks their victim with no apparent motives, and their actions are difficult to predict. The next question we need to ask ourselves when we are viewing violence in our school systems is what constitutes as violence in the school system. Like we previously discussed, the definition involves many types of acts, such as injury, abuse, damage, and destroying using physical force. We can also constitute violence as situations where both students and teachers are victimized. Crimes that are committed to either a student or teacher that result in violence. These actions can include rape, sexual assault, robbery, aggravated assault. It is not just a violence that involves a fistfight of some sort. There have been many accounts through the years of violence within a school system and noting these behaviors in a school setting. There has been minimal documentation of violent events before the middle of the 20th century based on research efforts. What we do know is what researchers like Midlarsky and Klain have found from archival records and antecedents. Clay tablets were discovered in archaeological dig sites in the Mesopotamia area dating back to 2000 BC, depicting student misbehaviors. Now let's fast forward to the medieval times. Right before this time period, schools were not thought of as a necessity for children. Therefore, it wasn't mandated that children had to attend schools. As we start to get into the 1500s, we start to see a change where more students start to attend schools. At this point, violence among students was widespread as education started to become mandatory for previously unschooled students. Because of students' pushback on education becoming mandatory, we find that the disciplinary problems start to become rampant and are addressed by executing corporal punishment on the students. And corporal punishment involves the hitting of someone. So in this case, it would be the teacher spanking the student. After medieval times, we start to look at violence in education during our emerging nation, which refers to the colonial time period. So in the year 1635, the first public school was established in our nation. At the beginning of this establishment, schools were relatively safe havens from violence. But at the same time progressed, the schools started to become more violent as an effect of the students' community environment. As the Civil War started, students were exposed to a chaotic and volatile community, which in turn influenced their own behavior in the classroom. Students who committed violence were motivated by rebellion, protest, and anger, fearing their community's feelings from the ongoing conflicts in the colonies. Some examples of violence in the colonial times would be student violence towards their teacher. The students would often try to get rid of their school teacher by attacking them with chairs or threaten to the teachers about breaking their neck. In response to these violent acts, teachers brought up their concerns to the colonial tribunal, who decided the punishments for the students. In Greencastle, Pennsylvania, on July 1764, we have the first record of a school shooting. In this case, the French and Indian War was right in the midst of going on. 4 Lenape warriors stormed into the Greencastle school and commenced a wholesale slaughter and fired freely upon the school. As a result of their slaughter, the school teacher and 10 children lost their lives to the Lenape, leaving only 3 students to survive. So what would we be classifying this violence as? This violence would be classified as an action out of anger, as the Lenape people were angered by the bad politics and the warfare of the French and Indian War. Then from 1780 to 1860, we had violent actions during an emerging nation. So after the Revolutionary War, the educational system started to change and coincide with the birth of our new nation. Schools started to promote educating virtues on discipline, sacrifice, simplicity, intelligence, liberty, and government, all in which have led to the educational system we have set in place today. Even though the changes were made during the early post-revolutionary period, we still find school environments remaining chaotic and disorderly. As time moved on to the late 18th and early 19th century, the American nation started to redefine its role and identity within the global community, influencing not just other nations, but ours as well. Communities started to come together and gain a better understanding, which started to mend students' behavioral problems. On November 1st of 1853, we have the first child shooting teacher case. 13-year-old Matthew Ward was upset by the excessive punishment given to his brother by the teacher. In retaliation, he bought a self-cocking pistol and shot the teacher at point-blank range in front of his classmates at school. From the 1860s to the year 1900, we encountered school violence during the Industrial Revolution. At this time, the school system was finally accepted as the norm for children's daily life after the war. At the conclusion of the war, the 31 states made attending school mandatory for children by 1900. This educational system, developed during the Industrial Revolution, was designed to disseminate Americanism, thus creating more school governments. Singing patriotic songs and reciting the pledge became the norm for schools at this time. These actions promoted students' learning to become more productive members of society. As patriotic members of society were being produced, violence still remained a threat in the school system. These new educational systems had a lack of discipline in place for students, poor teaching methods, and the students were still disruptive and had violent behaviors during classes. Schools were considered a wild and unruly place at this time. In June of 1867, we had the first child shooting child case to first be reported. A 13-year-old brought a loaded gun to the class and shot a fellow classmate, injuring him in the process. As there was no apparent reason for the shooting, we would classify that act as a random act of violence. A Massachusetts school teacher at a Barstow was stoned by 4 students in 1870. The students wanted retaliation for the teacher locking one of her other students who refused to return to class after being called in from their lunch break. The result of the stoning left Barstow weakened and ultimately contributed heavily to her death. This case would be an example of violence motivated by anger. On April 9th of 1891, we had the first recorded mass school shooting. A 70-year-old man targeted the students on the playground of St. Mary's Patriarchal School in Newburgh, New York. As a result of the man's actions, 5 male students suffered minor injuries. As we have discussed, there are many types of violence and reasons why violence occurs in our schools. Let's now take a look at some of the major contributing factors of student violence. According to Doreen Arcus, the nature of violence and its causes have been as diverse as the surrounding culture and social forces in operation with them. This just means violence has been present since the beginning. It is not an unnatural occurrence. Throughout history, we can find 5 major factors that contribute to violence: corporal punishment, bullying, intrapersonal factors, media exposure, and the availability of weapons. The use of corporal punishment in the school system is meant to combat student behavior in the early years. According to Arcus, the socialization of children by violent means, such as corporal punishment, creates an environment in which violence will be accepted as the norm. Through this ideology, students learn that the powerful control the weak through authoritarian means. That environment of using corporal punishment gives rise to the students' belief power assertion is the primary means of disciplining and are likely to become aggressive and violent. Although this would give to some reasoning for the student's behavior, there is still no definite causation established as to the relation of student behavior and corporal punishment. Bullying is another prominent factor when questioning what influences violence in students. The victimization by school bullies can be a predictor of those bullying others' suicidal thoughts and suicide. Not only does bullying consist of physical aggression, it also includes taunting and destruction of personal property by an individual or a group. In most cases of school shootings, we can see the result bullying has on its victims, because in most cases, the shooter has been that victim. Interpersonal forces is our third contributing factor of violence in schools. These are things such as emotional disturbances, exposure to violence in their home, or substance abuse. It was found by Patrick Harper and Farah Ibram that these forces often contribute to students' behavior along with intergenerational antisocial behavior. Anger, depression, and deficits in coping skills can also be seen as a factor to students who are lacking a good support system and therefore turn to violence. Media exposure is the fourth factor that we can find evidence that contributes to violence. Popular entertainment groups that promote or emphasize celebrity violence ignites youth fascination with the celebrity, and in turn with the violence the celebrity is unwillingly or unknowingly promoting. In McVeigh and Capoli's research, they theorize that violence portrayed in media has begun to desensitize our youths to the horror of murder by starting to normalize those acts for them. For example, a week after the media reported the massacre in Littleton, Colorado, there was at least one copycat threat that was reported in the other 49 states in America. In Pennsylvania alone, it was reported that there were more than 60 of those copycat threats reported. The fifth and final contributing factor is the availability of weapons. Researchers like Flannery and Singer have found that juveniles with easy access to guns and an express fascination for weapons are related to school violence, especially among the male gender. It has also been argued that without easy access to these firearms, many acts of school violence would not take place in recent years. So what do you think? Do you agree that if we had more firearm restrictions, the many acts of school violence that students partake in would have lessened?
Thanks, Rachel. That was a lot of useful information, which actually leads me, I'm Vinny, by the way, and that leads me to my first topic, which is what is antisocial behavior? A lot of the times when you just say violence, you just think of, fighting right away. Violence is something that has been in the world since its creation. If you're a religious person, you read the Bible, you know that it's a very, very violent world. And so we're not talking specifically about just violence amongst humans, but this typical antisocial behavior in school when children lash out at their classmates or their teachers. This is what we would typically call antisocial behavior. We can define it as a recurrent violation of socially prescribed patterns of behavior, usually involving aggression, vandalism, rule infractions, defiance of adult authority, and violations of social norms in general. And as I mentioned, violence and aggression are examples of this type of behavior. And we usually see this in students who are dissatisfied with their educational experience altogether, but also just students in general who may not know how to deal with frustration or failure. And school is a place of much failure. In fact, that's kind of how we learn. We learn from our failure and we grow from it. But we have seen that there are kids that don't handle it well and they act out, whether it be vocally or physically. This was something I thought was awesome. It was from a journal article I read, and she said in her dissertation, she was actually writing about why kids fight, specifically gangs, why gangs fight in school, why they like to do that so much. And she said some individuals believe that aggression is formed by the individual's life development, while others think that it's the social environment that causes it. Meaning, wherever you're born, that's pretty much how you're going to behave. Wherever you live, who you grow up around, that's going to decide how you behave, and if you're someone that is antisocial. Which leads me to my next topic, specifically about one of the biggest problems in America, and that is gangs. And the reason why I go to it so quick is because gangs are the type of organizations that gravitate to the antisocial kids. In fact, they see them, and in any kind of way, if they'd see their own kind of antisocial behavior, they would pick him out. That guy is one that I can get. And the gangs have been evident in America for a very long time. But in the 1950s and the 1960s is when you really saw the formation of many, many gangs. The numbers rose dramatically. And in 2007 alone, there was an estimated 788,000 gang members. That's an unbelievable amount. And I believe the numbers have risen. While gangs are mainly found in bigger cities, they are starting to make their way to smaller cities. But that actually brings me to my next slide, where when big cities were being made in America, Now, this is actually from a geography class I had the privilege of taking. I took it as an elective, and I actually really enjoyed it. And one of the main things I learned was this fact was when we create cities, we create them to accommodate a certain class of citizen. And so you often get the rich people living with the rich people, the middle people living in between them and the poor people. And so often, the poor people, they don't have much. They don't have much in regards to, items, but also they don't have much support in their life, in their lifestyle. And so they get categorized, I'm sorry, as gang members. As we can see, what constitutes a gang member, it's 3 or more individuals associated periodically as an ongoing criminal group or organization. This group has an identifying name and a sign or symbol associated with the group. This group also has a leader who organizes criminal and violent activity. And so you see that when you talk gangs, you might think, because of TV, you might think of, old men doing criminal activity. Yeah, that's elevated. But what we're talking about specifically is the gangs that get formed, they go on to that later in life, but how they start is from 8 to 22 is what really constitutes the gangs that we're talking about. And so specifically, these are kids in school. They're forming their gangs while they're going to school. They're deciding pretty much that, following the norms of school doesn't make sense to them when they can form a gang with people who believe the same kind of things that they believe. And once again, it goes back to the geography of kind of the situation you're put in, to where it seems like you're given no choice if no one's going to pay attention to your studies and no one's going to pay attention to what you're doing outside of school. You're free. You can do whatever you want. And that's what they do. They form gangs, and they use fear. I believe that's on my next slide is what I'm trying to say. They use the fear to control, the student body. And because they've never gotten the love from others, they use the gangs to fill the role as their family. And like, that is where they're finding love. And it's so easy for them to say, hey, let's do this. And, you love these people. They're people that have shown you the only type of support ever. So you easily follow them. And that's kind of what I was going to go with. How do they put, students at risk? Well, specifically, one of the studies that I read was people that bring weapons, people that get into fights. A lot of them are gang members. And I'll get to this later, that most of them, I should say, 30% of the fights, if you will, are from gang members, but that's a big number. Besides what Rachel was saying on, just the random act of violence, that happens a lot in schools. And that's most of the violence in school, I would say, are random acts. But that's what's scary, is that the planned acts are from these gangs. If you're a student who knows that a gang wants to beat you up, how are you supposed to go to school every day and think freely and not worry about looking over your shoulder? Because these are the people that come to inside. This isn't, and at that too, besides their plan, what about if you bumped into, a gang member around his gang, and if he doesn't act tough in front of his buddies, well, now, so you're fighting in that regard too. So just the fact that gangs are at school, they bring the possibility of more violence. And it also stinks because they live a certain lifestyle that is established with certain cultures. And so kids, a part of that culture, will often get confused with a gang member. And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate to see. I have a personal story. My dad, he really did. If you were to constitute what a gang member looked like in the late 80s in Los Angeles, it would probably, my father was like that. But it's just, once again, it's where he came from. It's who he grew up with. And so he looked like them. While he went to school and got good grades and played baseball, his buddies weren't doing the same thing. And so he would be walking, down the street, and a cop would see him and say, hey, where are the homies at? What are you guys doing? And he's like, man, I'm literally walking to school. I'm walking to school. Go, why are you bothering me? Why don't you go, look for them? I'm not with them. And it's unfortunate that that happens to other students. You know, just think about the same thing my dad went through. Kids just maybe walking home looking to do his homework, and he's, you know, getting harassed by the police for being a gang member. But that's here or there. And I'd like to get back to the fact that it's this fear that gangs try to impose on other students, but just without gangs imposing the fear, it's just there in general for whatever reason. A lot of good things that Rachel said, you know, the media, just home life. If, you know, you may go to a good school and you may get treated well by all of your teachers, but you come home and it's, you know, it's, you can learn it anywhere. And I kind of wanted to go back to that quote that I was saying where, you know, people said, well, it's learned. People said, no, you're going to be that way no matter what. I honestly think it's a possibility of both. It's, if you're around a lot of violence, you have a good chance of being a violent person. If you live in an area where violence is evident, you probably have a good chance of being a violent person. And that brings me to, you know, Rachel stopped at 1900s, and that's pretty much where I took over. And as much as violence has been involved in, you know, the world and just the school systems in the United States in general, um, I forgot what I was trying to say. I'm sorry. I think I was trying to say that that fear, once again, is it's just, it's in the world, it's in students without having the, you know, the fear of gangs attacking you. It's just the constant, maybe, you know, fear of, if you don't stand up for yourself, is it going to continue to happen? It's the fear, you know, of what others are thinking of you. And it doesn't just go along with physical violence, but aggression, verbal aggression. You know, do you always have to argue? Do you always have to have something to say to a student, to another student, sorry. Um, and that's what brings me to my point, is that one of the articles I read was very informational. It said, you know, students who experience the fear are the ones engaging in physical activity. And in the 90s, we saw just an unbelievable, unbelievable amount of violence. And I think that's where I was actually trying to go, is as evident as it's been, it got even worse in the 90s. And, you know, in 1993, this was an actual number that they estimated, that 2,000 students, I'm sorry, and 40 teachers were attacked every hour. And that's, you know, the possibility is there because there's so many schools in America. And, you know, most of the altercations they didn't have weapons. They weren't a school shooting, as we've seen. They weren't gang related. There was just one of those acts of violence, just random acts of aggression, which leads me to my next slide, where there was roughly 960,000 school-based incidents of, you know, just simple assault, ranging from 12 to 18. And I'd like to just take that back to the media exposure. You know, 12 to 8, this is when you start to develop that sense of independence, and you start to behave of, you know, it resembles what you think and what you have seen throughout your life. And to go back to it, once again, freshmen in high school are more likely to get in these fights. And that's something we've learned, that, you know, their frontal lobes, they're not fully developed. They don't fully recognize appropriate social situations. So, oh yeah, I can punch him, boom, right? And, you know, it doesn't make any sense to us, but to them, it makes perfect sense. And I just wanted to mention dating violence just shortly. It's, you know, it starts in middle school, same time, you know, 12 to 18. And we don't, thankfully in all the statistics, you don't see a lot of male on female on male violence. But if you were to ever see it, almost 100% had something to do with a dating situation. And we've talked about it, and I know people will touch more on it, but bullying is more often than not, when you talk about the extreme violence, it's because of bullying. But especially when it comes to just the random acts, kids, of what I said, you know, if you're being bullied in front of people, you always have to worry about how you perceive. And no matter how much you wish it'd go away, that's pretty much what high school is. It's just people judging your every move, and you having to grow up and decide that, is that going to bother me or not? But as we said, it's, you know, it's not always physical. It's just, it can be mental. It can be the constant remarks people make to you, and maybe you don't know how to take it, and because they aren't good at communicating, and neither are you, whatever it may be, you let those remarks build up, and they create this aggression in you. And that will bring me to the fact that we really need to recognize these signs. And when you see these acts of aggression, you should take them into consideration, because studies show that, early signs of violence, they will lead to future violence. If people are constantly thinking that it's okay to act violent, that they're going to do it. They're going to continue to do it. A study conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found that about 20% of all students need mental health services. And that is kind of where I'm leaning towards, is if our frontal lobes aren't fully developed when we're in high school and we have problems, that can lead to even more serious problems. And that I've actually spoken on that in future posts, I believe, and in a few of my papers, that, mental health is something that needs to start being considered more of the problem rather than the act of violence. It should be more, why does he think it's okay to be violent or to behave and to say things that are violent? And as far as the warning signs, an easy one is, someone who doesn't receive a whole lot of social support. Those are the ones, it makes sense that they would be the ones with the mental health problems. Yeah, it's crucial. It could lead to more, and we've seen it, unfortunately, on the news, that it will lead to more than just physical and verbal violence. I just wanted to mention again, the movies, the video games, the music, it all leads to this. And between the 80s and the 90s, we hadn't seen many school shootings, but they rose unbelievable, 23 to 179, and then 90s to 2000s, 179 to 245. So far too many, far too many. And Rachel had mentioned it, that most of the school shooters they're dealing with a combination of having access to guns while also dealing with some kind of significant loss, whether it's mental or it's literal loss in their life. And that fear is just evident. It's overwhelmed them, and it's what we see. And that brings me to the most unfortunate part, when that fear gets to be just a little too much, that death happens in school. And it's scary to think of as an incoming teacher, but between 94 and 95, there was 220 school events that resulted in 253 deaths. And 202 of the events reported just one death, while 18 reported two or more. But I think we can all agree that even one death at a school is far too many. And, more than, I think you could call it 99% of the cases, the students who were involved were students who were bullied. And it's an unfortunate problem that I know another group will touch on, the bullying problem. But it's definitely something that as a teacher we should look out for, because I don't know if I skipped it or what, but one of the things that was, one of the facts they wanted to give to the people was that in these situations when kids aren't receiving much social support, it's actually the teacher. If they're not receiving it from their parents, it's actually the teacher who they want that from. They don't get it from their friends at that, but they wouldn't even want the support from their friends. They actually look to support from their teachers. So events like my next slide, I think most people know about Columbine in 1999. And two students, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, they entered their high school in Littleton, Colorado, and they brutally killed 12 of their classmates and a teacher after they committed suicide in the library where many of their victims were. And they were, of course, kids who were not very popular, bullied kids. In fact, they were in this group in school called the Trenchcoat Mafia. And so that's why they looked inconspicuous when they were just walking in their trench coats when they hid their guns. But the most interesting, when I researched it, I researched, Columbine, and the first thing that popped up was someone that researched it And he actually did a survey with thousands of people on who they thought was at fault for Columbine. And the majority didn't say it was the kids. They said it was their surroundings, the kids that were bullying them to cause them to think, their parents. And unfortunately, that's up for debate. But I just wanted to mention that I saw one of the shooter's parents give a TED talk. She just seemed like the sweetest lady who was nothing but positive. So it's up for debate on how that they develop these feelings of wanting to bring death to school. It's unfortunate, but Kathy, I pass it to you.
Thank you, Vinny. So I'll be focusing on public school violence from 2006 to 2020, because 2020 is part of our history now. So over the last 14 years, we've seen an increase in public school violence, with some trends kind of remaining stable. So these are events witnessed in our lifetime that unfortunately have begun to feel expected and almost the norm, specifically school shootings, which Vinny just covered. So violence, as we mentioned previously, is broad in the sense that it's not solely physical harm done to a person. And we'll dive a little more into details as I keep going forward. So school shootings, also known as domestic terrorism, because it is happening on US soil by our students. Next slide, please. So the data that I pulled, I used from the K-12 school shooting database, which documents when a gun is brandished, aspired, or a bullet hits school property for any reason, regardless of the number of victims, time of day, or day of the week. Next slide. So here, and sorry, I didn't mention, that's from the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. There's a link provided here if you're interested in looking deeper into a specific state. But this is what it looks like. The number of school shootings totaled 794 from 2006 to 2020. Very spotty. You see a lot of it more on the eastern side of the country. And we do have some, of course, Midwest and then West Coast. Next slide, please. So these are the types of situations that occur that have led up to shootings. It doesn't always mean it's a mass shooting. So like I said before, if a weapon is brandished or a bullet ejected from a gun. So there's suicide and attempted suicide. Gang related, like Vinny had mentioned before, that is a big one. Specifically here in the Valley, I know my own personal experience in high school, a lot of the fights that were going on were because of gangs. Dating and domestic violence is also a big one, which we don't talk about enough, but that is something that's happening to a lot of students, a lot of teens and youth. Disputes, so verbal altercations, drive-by shootings, accidental bullying. As we know, bullying is a major factor in violence in schools. Illegal activities, that could be anything like maybe an exchange of like drugs or anything like that. Hostage or standoff, murder, suicide, anger over grade, suspension, discipline. That's typically like a retaliation. A student doesn't like that they were disciplined, so they'll act out. Mentally ill. Indiscriminate shooting, that's also random shootings, self-defense, and intentional property damage. Next slide, please. So I wanted to narrow it down. In California, within the ranges of 2006 to 2020, there were 73 school shootings, 20 of which were in elementary schools, 10 in middle schools, 1 in a K through 8 school, 41 in high schools, and 1 which was a 6th to 12th grade. It's actually a school in San Francisco that was permanently closed. So in Fresno, I narrowed it down even more because we're in Fresno, there were 2 school shootings. So these were actually pretty recent. In December 19th of 2013 at Edison High School, this was after school hours. There was an attempted robbery nearby. A lady was she was mugged and hurt by 4 teenagers. So they actually made their way onto campus, and there was an athletic trainer, a teacher who was hurt by the four. He was shot several times. He did try to fight off the shooters, and they were sentenced in court. Something to remember about these situations is that there's not just a physical pain that the person's feeling. This person was left with physical traumas, as well as mental, emotional. So not only is this person seeking therapy physically, but also psychiatrists, therapists, things like that. Something to keep in mind too is that these are traumas that we can also pass on generationally. You also have to consider if there were witnesses, what traumas they also carry. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So Roosevelt High School, this was actually a pretty big one. This made national news. The LA Times actually covered this as well. Roosevelt High School in April of 2008, a school resource officer shot and killed a 17-year-old boy. He was actually he was a mentally unstable student or mentally ill. It was said that he attacked the police officer with a bat. He kind of blindsided him and hit him on the back of the head. The police officer had reached for his gun, but the clip fell out. So he instead reached for a semi-automatic weapon he had in his holster, in his ankle, and he shot the student in his chest, and he died. So there's a lot of controversy that comes with that, because school resource officers, they're there to protect, but then you have situations like this where you wonder, well, could he have used a taser, a baton? And in one of the interviews with his mom, with the student's mom, she said, they have other things they could have done. Why did they shoot my son? And whatever side you're on, there are other ways. So Fresno PD was actually calling this a suicide by cop. And because the student was mentally ill, or he had mental health issues, better said, you start to wonder what kind of resources are available at schools. So something that I noticed was that, and they do this is a practice, just protocol that schools take after an incident like this, they up the amount of social workers and therapists at schools, or psychologists. And that's what happened here. So you start to wonder, why don't we have more of those resources? And did this student fall within the cracks? Did he fall between the cracks? So go ahead, next slide, please. All right, so Texas, I chose Texas because California's a little more liberal. Texas is a little different. And I was actually surprised to see that it was less than California. But this is what the data shows. So 62 school shootings, 10 were in elementary school, 6 in middle school, and 46 in high school. So in 2020, there were still shootings. 2020 is that year, the pandemic year. Schools were not shooting down, sorry. Schools were shutting down. There was a lot more distance learning. That's what we've been doing. So you would think that there would be less, or I figured there would be a lot less, but the data was pretty surprising. There were a total of 113 school incidents on a school campus. So I broke it down by season. In the wintertime, there were 29. In the springtime, there were 15. Summer, 16. Fall, 53. So what I noticed here is that in the springtime, which is around the time about March, where everybody started to switch to online, that's where you saw the decrease. Same thing in the summer. There were still schools that were open. In the fall, you see that uptick, and that could be because there were schools that were starting to reopen. If you look September, October, November, some school districts had decided their students were gonna return back to school. Next one, please. Okay, so the school shootings, I didn't want to touch too much into it. I know it is a very sensitive topic and can be triggering to some people, but I wanted to just highlight some of the major shootings. So in 2007, Virginia Tech, this was exactly 8 years after Columbine. which could have been a coincidence or it could have been done on purpose. So there were 32 deaths and 23 injured. Sandy Hook Elementary. Sandy Hook Elementary was really sad. All of these were, but this one was pretty tragic. At the time, I was working with preschool. So you feel some kind of connection to this when a lot of the children were very young as kindergartners. This happened in Newton, Connecticut. A younger man, he was about 20 years old. His name is Adam Lanza. He was obsessed with mass shootings. And like Rachel and Vinny had mentioned earlier, there are those who copycat, who are so obsessed with these shootings that they carry them out themselves. The FBI actually categorized his interest. Adam had such an interest in children, and they categorized it as pedophilia. So Sandy Hook, this happened December 14th, not 2021. And it was 26 deaths. One of the most recent, which was, well, a lot of these garner a lot of media attention, but I think this one really put themselves on the map because of the work that a lot of the survivors were doing. Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, back in 2018, February 17th, 2018, resulted in 17 deaths and 17 injured. What's interesting about this is that there was a deputy on campus, one hired. I mean, they work with the school districts and they are placed at the schools. If you guys recall, he didn't act and he left. So there was this mass shooting. Next one, please. So some questions that come up are school shootings becoming normal? Because we hear about them so often, just as much as we hear about mass shootings happening, at stores, at movie theaters. It's something to think about. And what are school districts doing to prevent shootings? Some things that they are doing is they're paying more attention to security, social emotional needs of students, social emotional learning, and active shooter drills. If anybody's participated in active shooter drills, they're very ugly, but very necessary, unfortunately. The social emotional learning too, I know that's taught as professional learning for teachers. It's just something new that a new focus, which is good. I know, as Vinny had mentioned before, the mental health supports that are needed for students, but also for teachers and staff. That's also needed. Next one, please. So we're in 2021 and racism, it always exists. So that's something that I really wanted to touch on, is racially motivated violence in schools. And this is violence towards groups of a particular race or ethnic group. Next slide, please. So the Jena 6, you might be familiar with this. Back in December of 2006, 6 Black teens in Jena, Louisiana were charged with attempted murder of a white classmate. So what happened was that there was a Black student. He asked if he could sit under a tree or if it was reserved for whites only. The following day, there were nooses hung from the same tree. So this tree was actually known to have white students. White students really hung out in that area. The school was pretty segregated. As with a lot of schools, though, you do find that there are a lot of cliques. Certain groups tend to hang in one area and others in others. And well, that was evident in the school. So the school actually dismissed it as a prank, but the so-called prank was a clear illustration of the reality of life in Jena. So the fight for racial justice, the excessive charges against the 6 Black boys called for nationwide protests, becoming some of the largest demonstrations since the civil rights movement era in the 50s. Next slide, please. So I wanted to fast forward 2019. If you all remember, here in Fresno, California, there was an incident of a 14-year-old white student, a female student, who recorded herself on social media in blackface. who said, "I can't say the N-word." That same student was seen in another video repeating the same word while on campus at Bullard High School. So this quickly spread like wildfire. Fresno, if you're familiar with Fresno, it is very, and I'll get into that in a bit, but there is redlining in the city. And like Vinny said, the way that cities are structured and the way that they're built, you have that separation of upper class, middle class, and lower class. So there's also classism, and that in turn creates a type of segregation, believe it or not. So that's something at Bullard High School, if you're familiar with Bullard, Bullard is on the northern side of town in a more affluent area. So this video made its rounds around the internet and it caught national attention as well. So the consequences for the student, she was actually allowed to remain on the cheerleading team with just light punishment of saying you missed 6 practices or 6 turns to compete. So the Fresno Unified Superintendent, Bob Nelson, acknowledged the incident and said to the Los Angeles Times that Fresno has a history of redlining that has segregated Fresno's neighborhoods. Bullard is located, like I said, in one of the most affluent areas in Fresno. He went along to say, if a student is Black, male, and enrolled in special education classes, he is 3 times more likely to be expelled or suspended. So these are things that we also have to look at as a school district and our role and what consequences we're imposing on our students. If you compare this to what happened in Jena, Louisiana, yes, they were different because in one there was a physical attack on somebody. This one is still racially charged, and the consequences were just a student missing out on some cheerleading time. Next slide. So bullying and assault. I know, like we said, there's another group doing bullying, but this is a huge factor, right? So 1 in 5 high school students have reported being bullied at school, at least in the last year. And this is data from about 2013 from the CDC. So what we do know is that bullying leads to many other issues, right? Social emotional issues such as depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, trauma, risky behavior, and even suicide. So acts of bullying can lead to students acting out on anger. Like we've mentioned before, a lot of the school shooters were victims of bullying. So there's physical violence. Victims and aggressors may act on bullying and the situation may turn physically violent. As seen in some school shooting cases, some murders for those who were known to be bullied. Next slide, please. So adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, what is this? This is a new term I learned recently while researching. So these are events that happen during childhood between the ages of 0 to 17 that can potentially be traumatic. So examples of trauma are witnessing violence in the home or in the community, victims of neglect, violence, or abuse, and abuse can be physical, emotional, and sexual. Having a member of family attempt or die by suicide, mental health issues, instability, and substance abuse. So according to the CDC, ACEs are associated social determinants of health, such as living in under-resourced or racially segregated neighborhoods. Frequently moving and experiencing food insecurities can cause toxic stress, extended or prolonged stress. Toxic stress from ACEs can change brain development and affect such things as attention, decision-making, learning, and response to stress. So this is key because, as Vinny was saying earlier, I want to go back on that, is how our frontal lobes have yet to fully develop. And if we're exposed to this amount of stress or witnessing violence, having these traumatic experiences, we carry that on later into our lives where we're more likely to partake in risky behavior. Next slide, please. All right. So what does the CDC have to say about school violence? So school violence is 100% a public health problem. It's not just centered into it's the school district's problem or it's just at home. This bleeds into society, into our communities. So why is it a problem? According to the CDC in 2014, there were roughly 486,400 non-fatal violent victimizations at schools among students 12 to 18 years old. That's a pretty high number. Not all injuries are visible though. These traumas can lead to health issues and behaviors, as I said earlier. So what about the teachers? Because it's not just students who are included too, right? About 9% of teachers reported to have been threatened by injury, threatened with injury by a student from their school site. 5% of teachers reported to have been physically attacked by a student. And I'm sure some of you have seen videos circulating around the internet and news of teachers being physically hit, and actually acting back out too in self-defense, and it gets a little wild. So, but teachers are another group to consider, as well as staff on school campuses. I work at a school, and I've come across situations where you're getting threats from a student, so it's not nice. So violent deaths, 31 homicides of school-aged youth ages 5 to 18 years old have been reported during the 12-13 school year. Of all youth homicides, less than 2.6% happen at school. So this percentage has actually remained stable in recent years. Next slide, please. Okay, so teen relationship abuse. So there's teen dating violence, and this is violence between, it can either be with your current partner or a former partner. And it affects millions of US teenagers every year. Male, female, non-binary, trans, it does not discriminate. So what is TDV, teen dating violence? It's violence experienced from a partner or a former partner in the form of psychological aggression, physical violence, sexual violence, and or stalking. And this isn't limited to just face-to-face, also on the internet. So some stats, the CDC reports that about 11 million women and 5 million men who reported experiencing TDV by an intimate partner experience this type of violence before the age of 18. It's quite a lot. So intimate partner violence is psychological aggression, physical violence, sexual violence, and stalking. When I was doing the research, it was more towards, this section was more about adults 18 or over, but this is also found in teen dating because, as we know, there's premarital relations going on. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is actually a common problem. This isn't something new, but like I said, it's not talked about as much. So there's physical violence, and about 1 in 11 females and approximately 1 in 14 male high school students reported having experienced physical dating violence in the last year. So something about these numbers is that we also have to think about how many males, because we don't hear about it as often, how many males are actually wanting to report it. And that comes a lot with their masculinity, right? And if I report this, if I say this is happening to me, I'll be less of a man, less of a male, or I'll be looked down as weak. And that's a stigma that we have to erase. We have to get rid of that, because a lot of males go through this, and they go through it as much as women do too. So sexual violence, 1 in 8 females, 1 in 16 males in high school reported having experienced sexual violence. And sexual violence is unwanted, inappropriate touching, sexual touching, and rape as well. Well, unwanted is rape. The problem, 26% of women and 15% of men who were victims of contact of sexual violence and or stalking by an intimate partner began before 18 years old. Next slide, please. So these are sometimes cycles. No More is a program run through the Marjorie Mason Center, and I'll get to that in my next slide. But they aim to educate the youth about the effects of abuse and teen relationship. So some of the information that they were able to share is that young girls, about half of the girls whose mothers are also victims of abuse, will become involved with abusive men. So this is part of the cycle. Young boys who are victims of abuse are 3 times more likely to become violent offenders. And witnesses of domestic violence, young boys who witness domestic violence are 6 times more likely to become violent offenders themselves. So this was pretty interesting to see that they're more likely to become offenders themselves, the aggressors. But I'm sure it happens with young girls as well. Next. So like I was saying, No More, the Marjorie Mason Center, they run with the Marjorie Mason Center. What is it? It's an educational program for youth to educate on the long-lasting effects of abuse in teen relationships. They provide resources and support to teens who have been affected by domestic violence. And the Marjorie Mason Center provides shelter and support services for victims of domestic violence in Fresno County. And it's the county's only domestic violence shelter. They have teamed up with surrounding school districts to complete their mission and vision. They do have, I know in some schools, they have some clubs where students can join, and then they're basically educating the students. And I know that they're working to really expand their program. So next, please. All right. So in conclusion, violence in public schools is nothing new. The reality is that as long as there is violence in society, it can and will be found in various institutions. We have learned of historical and current events that contribute to the overall issue, and have also learned that violence is not limited to the physical. The term encapsulates psychological as well. The very same violence found in schools can be products of cycles that ultimately bleed into society as a whole. While many call and fight for policy changes, the best prevention is education. And with that, we conclude.